Hotel Lima Alpha.
Greetings, friends. Apologies for my long absence. I was off haunting the forgotten corners of libraries, searching through dusty old tomes, and nearly got lost in the dark, which seems somewhat appropriate considering the time of year. For many, this is the season for festive activities, oftentimes with friends or family. This has been the case for as long as we can remember, or as long as Oliver Cromwell didn't have something to say about it. Traditions change and evolve to fit the lives we lead, some getting lost along the way. One such tradition was the sharing of scary stories. This season I'll be sharing 12 of them. As the days grow short and the nights stretch for what seems like a very cold eternity, pour yourself a warm drink and let us gather close so I may whisper these tales to you. The Doll's Ghost. It was a terrible accident, and for one moment the splendid machinery of the Cranston house got out of gear and stood still. The butler emerged from the retirement in which he spent his elegant leisure. 2 grooms of the chambers appeared simultaneously from opposite directions. There were actually housemaids on the grand staircase, and those who remember the facts most exactly assert that Mrs. Pringle herself politely stood upon the landing. The head nurse laid one hand upon the polished marble balustrade and stared stupidly before her. The under-nurse stood rigid and pale, leaning against the polished marble wall, and the nursery maid collapsed and sat down upon the polished marble step, just beyond the limits of the velvet carpet, and frankly burst into tears. The Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop, the youngest daughter of the 9th Duke of Cranston, and aged 6 and 3 months, picked herself up quite alone and sat down on the 3rd step from the foot of the grand staircase in the Cranston house. "Oh!" exclaimed the butler, and disappeared again. "Ah!" responded the grooms of the chamber, and they also went away. "It's only that doll," said Mrs. Pringle. "It's only that doll," Mrs. Pringle was distinctly heard to say, in a tone of contempt. The under-nurse heard her say. Then the 3 nurses gathered round Lady Gwendolen, and patted her and gave her unhealthy things out of their pockets, and hurried her out of the Cranston house as fast as they could, lest it be found out upstairs that they had allowed the Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop to tumble down the grand staircase with her doll in her arms. And the doll was badly broken. The nursery maid carried it, with the pieces wrapped up in Lady Gwendolen's little cloak. It was not far to Hyde Park, and when they had reached a quiet place they took means to find out that Lady Gwendolen had no bruises, for the carpet was thick and soft, and there was thick stuff under it to make it softer. Lady Gwendolen Douglas Scroop sometimes yelled, but never cried. It was because she had yelled that the nurses had allowed her to go downstairs alone with Nina, the doll, under one arm, while she steadied herself with the other hand on the balustrade, and trod upon the polished marble steps beyond the edge of the carpet. So she had fallen, and Nina had come to grief. When the nurses were quite sure that she was not hurt, they unwrapped the doll and looked at her in turn. She had been a very beautiful doll, very large and fair and healthy, with real yellow hair and eyelids that would open and shut over very grown-up-like dark eyes. Moreover, when you moved her right arm up and down, she said Papa, and when you moved the left, she said Mama very distinctly. "I heard her say Pa when she fell," said the under-nurse, who heard everything, "but she ought to have said Papa." "That's because her arm went up when she hit the step," said the head nurse. "She'll say the other Pa when I put it down." "Pa," said Nina, as her right arm was pushed down, speaking through the broken face. It was cracked right across from the upper corner of the forehead, with a hideous gash, through the nose, and down to the little frilled collar of the pale green silk Mother Hubbard frock, and 2 little 3-cornered pieces of porcelain had fallen out. "I'm sure it's a wonder she can speak at all, being all smashed," said the under-nurse. "You'll have to take it to Mr. Puckler," said her superior. "It's not far, and you'd better go at once." Lady Gwendolen was occupied in digging a hole in the ground with a little spade, and paid no attention to the nurses. "What are you doing?" inquired the nursery maid, looking on. "Nina's dead, and I'm digging her a grave," replied her ladyship thoughtfully. "Oh, she'll come to life again, all right," said the nursery maid. The under-nurse wrapped Nina up again and departed. Fortunately, a kind soldier with very long legs and a very small cap happened to be there, and as he had nothing to do, he offered to see the under-nurse safely to Mr. Puckler's and back. Mr. Bernard Puckler and his little daughter lived in a little house in a little alley, which led out of a quiet little street not very far from Belgrave Square. He was the great doll doctor, and his extensive practice lay in the most aristocratic quarter. He mended dolls of all sizes and ages, boy dolls and girl dolls, baby dolls in long clothes, and grown-up dolls in fashionable gowns, talking dolls and dumb dolls, and those that shut their eyes when they lay down, and those whose eyes had to be shut for them by means of a mysterious wire. His daughter Elsa was only just over 12 years old, but she was already very clever at mending dolls' clothes and at doing their hair, which is harder than you might think, though the dolls sit quite still while it is being done. Mr. Puckler had originally been a German, but he had dissolved his nationality in the ocean of London many years ago, like a great many foreigners had. He still had one or two German friends, however, who came over on Saturday evenings and smoked with him and played piquet or scot with him for farthing points, and called him Herr Doctor, which seemed to please Mr. Puckler very much. He looked older than he was, for his beard was rather long and ragged, and his hair was grizzled and thin, and he wore horn-rimmed spectacles. As for Elsa, she was a thin, pale child, very quiet and neat, with dark eyes and brown hair that was plaited down her back and tied with a bit of black ribbon. She mended dolls' clothes and took the dolls back to their homes when they were quite strong again. The house was a little one, but too big for the two people who lived in it. There was a small sitting room on the street, and the workshop was in the back, and there were 3 rooms upstairs, but the father and the daughter lived most of their time in the workshop, because they were generally at work, even in the evenings. Mr. Puckler laid Nina on the table and looked at her a long time, till tears began to fill his eyes behind his horn-rimmed spectacles. He was a very susceptible man, and he often fell in love with the dolls that he mended, and found it hard to part with them when they had smiled at him for a few days. They were real little people to him, with characters and thoughts and feelings of their own, and he was very tender with them all. But some attracted him especially from the first, and when they were brought to him maimed and injured, their state seemed so pitiful to him that tears came easily. You must remember that he lived among dolls during a great part of his life and understood them. "How do you know that they feel nothing?" he went on to say to Elsa. "You must be gentle with them. It costs nothing to be kind to little things, and perhaps it makes a difference to them." And Elsa understood him because she was a child, and she knew that she was more to him than these dolls. He fell in love with Nina at first sight, perhaps because of her beautiful brown glass eyes were something like Elsa's own, and he loved Elsa first and best with all his heart. And besides, it was a very sorrowful case. Nina had evidently not been long in the world, for her complexion was perfect, and her hair was smooth where it should be smooth, and curly where it should be curly, and her silk clothes were perfectly new, but across her face was that frightful gash, like a saber cut, deep and shadowy within, but clean and sharp at the edges. When he tenderly pressed her head to close the gaping wound, the edges made a fine grating sound that was painful to hear, and the lids of the dark eyes quivered and trembled as though Nina were suffering dreadfully. "Poor Nina!" he exclaimed sorrowfully. "But I shall not hurt you much, though you will take a long time to get strong." He always asked the names of the broken dolls when they were brought to him, and sometimes the people knew what the children called them and told him. He liked Nina for a name. Altogether and in every way she pleased him more than any doll he had seen for many years, and he felt drawn to her, and made up his mind to make her perfectly strong and sound, no matter how much labor it might cost him. Mr. Puckler worked patiently a little at a time, and Elsa watched him. She could do nothing for poor Nina, whose clothes needed no mending. The longer the doll doctor worked, the more fond he became of the yellow hair and the beautiful brown glass eyes, and he sometimes forgot all of the other dolls who were waiting to be mended, lying side by side on a shelf, and sat for an hour gazing at Nina's face while he racked his ingenuity for some new invention by which to hide even the smallest trace of the terrible accident. She was wonderfully mended. Even he was obliged to admit that, but the scar was still visible to his keen eyes, a very fine line right across the face, downwards from right to left. Yet all of the conditions had been most favorable for a cure, since the cement had set quite hard on the first attempt, and the weather had been fine and dry, which makes a great difference in a doll's hospital. At last he knew that he could do no more, and the under-nurse had already come twice to see whether the job was finished, as she coarsely expressed it. "Nina is not quite strong yet," said Mr. Puckler each time, for he could not make up his mind to face the parting. And now he sat before the square deal table at which he worked, and Nina lay before him for the last time, with a big brown paper box beside her. It stood there like her coffin, waiting for her, he thought. He must put her into it and lay tissue paper over her dear face, and then put on the lid. And at the thought of tying the string, his sight was dim with tears again. He was never to look into the glassy depths of those beautiful brown eyes any more, nor hear the little wooden voice say Papa or Mama. It was a very painful moment. In the vain hope of gaining time before the separation, he took up the little sticky bottles of cement and glue and gum and color, looking at each one in turn, and then at Nina's face. And all of his small tools lay there neatly arranged in a row, but he knew that he could not use them again for Nina. She was quite strong at last, and in a country where there should be no cruel children to hurt her, she might have lived 100 years, with only that and the almost imperceptible line across her face to tell of the fearful thing that had befallen her on the marble steps of the Cranston house. Suddenly, Mr. Puckler's heart was quite full, and he rose abruptly from his seat and turned away. "Elsa," he said unsteadily, "you must do it for me. I cannot bear to see her go into the box." So he went and stood at the window with his back turned while Elsa did what he had not the heart to do. "Is it done?" he asked, not turning around. "Then take her away, my dear. Put on your hat and take her to the Cranston house quickly, and when you are gone I will turn around." Elsa was used to her father's strange ways with the dolls, and though she had never seen him so much moved by a parting, she was not much surprised. "Come back quickly," he said, when he heard her hand on the hatch. "It is growing late, and I should not send you at this hour, but I cannot bear to look forward to it any more." When Elsa was gone, he left the window and sat down in his place before the table again, to wait for the child to come back. He touched the place where Nina had lain very gently. He recalled the softly tinted pink face, the glass eyes, and the ringlets of yellow hair, till he could almost see them. The evenings were long, for it was the spring, but it began to grow dark soon, and Mr. Puckler wondered why Elsa had not come back. She had been gone for an hour and a half, and that was much longer than he expected, for it was barely half a mile from Belgrave Square to the Cranston house. He reflected that the child might have been kept waiting, but as twilight deepened he grew anxious and walked up and down the dim workshop, no longer thinking of Nina, but of Elsa, his own living child, whom he loved. An undefinable, disquieting sensation came upon him in fine degrees. A chilliness and a faint stirring of his thin hair, joined with a wish to be in any company rather than alone much longer. It was the beginning of fear. He told himself in strong German English that he was a foolish old man, and he began to feel about for matches in the dusk. He knew just where they should be, for he always kept them in the same place, close to the little tin box that held bits of sealing wax of various colors for some kinds of mending. But somehow he could not find the matches in the gloom. Something had happened to Elsa, he was sure, and his fear increased. He felt as though it might be late if he could get a light and see what time it was. Then he called himself a foolish old man again, and the sound of his own voice startled him in the dark. He could not find the matches. The window was gray still. He might see what time it was if he went close to it, and he could go and get the matches out of the cupboard afterwards. He stood back from the table to get out of the way of the chair and began to cross the board floor. Something was following him in the dark. There was a small pattering, as of tiny feet upon the boards. He stopped and listened, and the roots of his hair tingled. He was nothing, and he was a foolish old man. He made 2 steps more, and he was sure he heard the little pattering again. He turned his back to the window, leaning against the sash so that the panes began to crack, and he faced the dark. Everything was quite still, and it smelled of paste and cement and wood filings as usual. "Is that you, Elsa?" he asked, and he was surprised by the fear in his voice. There was no answer in the room, and he held up his watch and tried to make out what time it was by the gray dusk that was just not darkness. As far as he could see, it was within 2 or 3 minutes of 10 o'clock. He had been alone for a long time. He was shocked and frightened for Elsa, out in London so late, and he almost ran across the room to the door. As he fumbled for the latch, he distinctly heard the running of little feet after him. "Mice!" he exclaimed feebly, just as he got the door open. He shut it quickly behind him, and felt as though some cold thing had settled on his back and were writhing upon him. The passage was quite dark, but he found his hat, and was out in the alley in a moment, breathing more freely, and surprised to find how much light there still was in the open air. He could see the pavement clearly under his feet, and far off in the street to which the alley led he could hear the laughter and calls of children playing some game out of doors. He wondered how he could have been so nervous. For an instant he thought of going back into the house to wait quietly for Elsa, but instantly he felt the nervous fright of something stealing over him again. In any case, it was better to walk up to the Cranston house and ask the servants about the child. One of the women had perhaps taken a fancy to her, and was even now giving her tea and cake. He walked quickly to Belgrave Square, then up the broad streets, listening as he went, whenever there was no other sound, for the tiny footsteps. But he heard nothing and was laughing at himself when he rang the servant's bell of the big house. Of course the child must be there. The person who opened the door was a quite inferior person, for it was the back door, but affected the manners of the front, and stared at Mr. Puckler superciliously under the strong light. No little girl had been seen, and he knew nothing about no dolls. "She's my little girl," said Mr. Puckler tremulously, for all his anxiety returning tenfold, "and I am afraid that something has happened. The inferior person said rudely that nothing could have happened to her in that house, because she has not been there, which was a jolly good reason why. And Mr. Puckler was obliged to admit that the man ought to know, as it was his business to keep the door and let people in. He wished to be allowed to speak to the under-nurse who knew him, but the man was ruder than ever, and finally shut the door in his face. When the doll doctor was alone in the street, he steadied himself by the railing, for he felt as though he were breaking in two, just as some dolls break, in the middle of the backbone. Presently he knew he must be doing something to find Elsa, and that gave him strength. He began to walk as quickly as he could through the streets, following every highway and byway in which his little girl may have taken her errand. He also asked several policemen in vain if they had seen her, and most of them had answered him kindly, for they saw that he was a sober man in his right senses, and some of them had little girls of their own. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when he went up to his own door again, worn out and hopeless and broken-hearted. As he turned the key in the lock, his heart stood still, for he knew that he was awake and not dreaming, and that he had really heard those tiny footsteps pattering to meet him inside the house along the passage. But he was too unhappy to be much frightened any more, and his heart went on again with a dull, regular pain that ground its way through him at every pulse. So he went in and hung up his hat in the dark, and found the matches in the cupboard, and the candlestick in its place in the corner. Mr. Puckler was so much overcome, and so completely worn out, that he sat down in his chair before the work-table and almost fainted, as his face dropped forward upon his folded hands. Beside him the solitary candle burned steadily, with a low flame, in the still warm air. "Elsa, Elsa," he moaned against his yellow knuckles. And that was all he could say, and it was no relief to him. On the contrary, the very sound of the name was a new and sharp pain that pierced his ears and his head, and his very soul. For every time he repeated the name, it meant little Elsa was dead somewhere out in the streets of London in the dark. He was so terribly hurt that he did not even feel something pulling gently at the skirt of his old coat, so gently that it was like the nibbling of a tiny mouse. He might have thought it really was a mouse if he had noticed it. "Elsa, Elsa," he groaned right against his hands. Then a cool breath of air stirred his thin hair, and the low flame of the one candle dropped down almost to a mere spark, not flickering as though a draught were going to blow it out, but just dropping down as if it were tired out. Mr. Puckler felt his hands stiffening with fright under his face, and there was a faint rustling sound, like some small silk thing blown in a gentle breeze. He sat up straight, stark and scared, and a small wooden voice spoke in the stillness. "Papa," it said, with a break in the syllables. Mr. Puckler stood up in a single jump, and his chair fell over backwards with a smashing noise upon the wooden floor. The candle had almost gone out. It was Nina's doll voice that had spoken, and he should have known it among the voices of 100 other dolls. Yet there was something more in it, a little human ring, with a pitiful cry and a call for help, and the wail of a hurt child. Mr. Puckler stood up, stark and stiff, and tried to look around, but at first he could not, for he seemed to be frozen from head to foot. Then he made a great effort, and he raised one hand to each of his temples, and pressed his own head round, as if he would have turned it all. The candle was burning so low that it might as well have been out altogether, for any light it gave in the room seemed quite dark at first. Then he saw something. He would not have believed that he could have been more frightened than he had just been before that, but he was, and his knees shook, for he saw the doll standing in the middle of the floor, shining with a faint and ghostly radiance, her beautiful glassy brown eyes fixed on his. And across her face the very thin line of the break he had mended shone as though it were drawn in light with a fine point of white flame. Yet there was something more in her eyes, too, something more human, like Elsa's own. But as if only the doll saw him through them, and not Elsa. And there was enough of Elsa to bring back all of his pain and make him forget his fear. "Elsa, my little Elsa," he cried out. The small ghost moved, and its doll arm slowly rose and fell with a stiff mechanical motion. "Papa," it said. It seemed this time that there was even more of Elsa's tone echoing somewhere between the wooden notes that reached his ears so distinctly and yet so far away. Elsa was calling him, he was sure. His face was perfectly white in the gloom, but his knees did not shake any more, and he felt that he was less frightened. "Yes, child, but where? Where?" he asked. "Where are you, Elsa?" "Papa!" The syllables died away in the quiet room. There was a low rustling of silk, and the glassy brown eyes turned slowly away, and Mr. Puckler heard the pitter-patter of the small feet in the bronze kid slippers as the figure ran straight to the door. Then the candlelight burned high again, and the room was full of light, and he was alone. Mr. Puckler passed his hand over his eyes and looked about him. He could see everything quite clearly. He felt as if he must have been dreaming, though he was standing instead of sitting down, as he should have been if he had just woken up. The candle burned brightly now, and there were dolls to be mended lying in a row with their toes up. The third one had lost her right shoe, and Elsa was making a new one. He knew that, and he was certainly not dreaming now. He had not been dreaming when he had come in from his fruitless search and had heard the doll's footsteps running to the door. He had not fallen asleep in his chair. How could he possibly have fallen asleep when his heart was breaking? He had been awake all the time. He steadied himself, set the fallen chair upon its legs, and said to himself again very emphatically that he was a foolish old man. He ought to be out in the streets looking for his child, asking questions, and inquiring the police stations, where all accidents were reported as soon as they were known, or at the hospitals. "Papa!" The longing, wailing, pitiful little wooden cry rang from the passage outside the door, and Mr. Puckler stood for an instant with white face transfixed and rooted in the spot. A moment later his hand was on the latch, and then he was in the passage, with the light streaming from the open door behind him. Quite at the other end he saw the little phantom shining clearly in the window, and the right hand seemed to beckon him as the arm rose and fell once more. He knew all at once that it had not come to frighten him, but to lead him, and when it disappeared, and he walked boldly towards the door, he knew that it was on the street outside waiting for him. He forgot that he was tired and that he had not eaten supper, and had walked for miles, for a sudden hope ran through and through him like a golden stream of light. And sure enough, at the corner of the alley, and at the corner of the street, and out in Belgrave Square, he saw the small ghost flitting before him. Sometimes it was only a shadow where there was other light, but then the glare of the lamps made the pale green sheen on its little Mother Hubbard frock of silk, and sometimes, where the streets were dark and silent, the whole figure shone brightly, with its yellow curls and rosy neck. It seemed to trot along like a tiny child, and Mr. Puckler could almost hear the pattering of the bronze kid slippers on the pavement as it ran. But it went very fast, and he could only just keep up with it, tearing along with his hat on the back of his head, and his thin hair blown by the night breeze, and his horn-rimmed spectacles firmly set upon his broad nose. On and on he went, and he had no idea where he was. He did not even care, for he knew certainly that he was going the right way. Then, at last, in a wide, quiet street, he was standing before a big, sober-looking door that had 2 lamps on each side, and a polished brass bell handle which he pulled. And just inside, when the door was open, in the bright light, there was a little shadow, and the pale green sheen of the little silk dress. And once more the small cry came to his ears, less pitiful and more longing. "Papa!" The shadow turned suddenly bright, and out of the brightness of the beautiful brown eyes were turned happily up to him, while the rosy mouth smiled so divinely that the phantom doll almost looked like a little angel just then. A little girl was brought in soon after 10 o'clock, said the quiet voice of the hospital doorkeeper. I think they thought she was only stunned. She was holding a big brown paper box against her, and they could not get it out of her arms. She had a long plait of brown hair that hung down as they carried her. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckley, but he hardly heard his own voice. He leaned down over Elsa's face in the gentle light of the children's ward, and when he had stood there for a minute, the beautiful brown eyes opened and looked up at his. "Papa," cried Elsa softly, "I knew you would come." Mr. Puckler did not know what he said or did for a moment, and what he felt was worth all the fear and terror and despair that had almost killed him that night. But by and by Elsa was telling her story, and the nurse let her speak, for there were only 2 other children in the room who were getting well and were sound asleep. "They were big boys with bad faces," said Elsa, "and they tried to get Nina away from me, but I held on and fought as well as I could until one of them hit me with something, and I don't remember any more, for I tumbled down, and I suppose the boys ran away, and somebody found me there, but I'm afraid Nina is all smashed." "Here's the box," said nurse. "We could not take it out of her arms until she came to herself. Should you like to see if the doll is broken?" And she undid the string cleverly, but Nina was all smashed to pieces. Only the gentle light of the children's ward made a pale green sheen in the folds of the little Mother Hubbard frock. That is it for tonight. I do hope you enjoyed this little story, and I do hope that you will join us again next time for another scary story. Until then, good night, whatever you are.